Okay, let's begin with the world of cotton made today. The end of the War of 1812, as is a lot of moments in American history, is one of the more significant movements and migrations of people in American history. We had one in 1763 at the end of the 7 Years' War, the end of the American Revolution. The 1763 one I don't think is fully appreciated, how the reordering of North America, where the French are gone and the Spanish move in and the British have proved triumphant fighting their two traditional enemies, is really something that we're beginning to appreciate more and more. And certainly we should here in 1815 and 1816. You know, Americans are fascinating that we never let war become an excuse for making money and going on the move and finding new opportunities. It really was an explosion in the American Southwest, which is often, as I said last time, overshadows the movement of people to the Great Lakes states, because we're adding states two at a time at this point in pairs. Well, up until we get to Missouri, which we're going to get to either today or next time. Of course, what instigates this and the world that cotton makes is a perfect storm of factors, technological factors, demographic factors. We hinted at some of the changes that would happen in the population because of the movement of slavery to the Deep South. We acquired 14 million acres from the Creek Indians. Jackson sends an engineer right after the Battle of Horseshoe Bend and the Treaty of Fort Jackson to begin to survey the area and buy up land on his own, and a lot of people buy land as well. He sees there, as do his soldiers, the improved Indian lands and farms. Many of those were abandoned because the Indians gave up the land, even those who had sided with Andrew Jackson, and they were forced off this area. Not surprisingly, we see squatters and everyone else who has title to land and doesn't have title to the land move into the area because the land can seem to support anybody. And that's where there is the success. And that is where, again, the land is there, the people are there, the people to work, those who are enslaved, small farmers. Not everyone there obviously is a slave owner. And then the technological transformations that happen and the worldwide economy are all factors to make the cotton world explode after 1815 and 1816. The treaty was controversial, the Treaty of Fort Jackson, but Madison orders the army to move off the land, to enforce it, even though many people who were trying to take over that land to move into the American Southwest, even while the negotiations for the treaty were taking place, you know, Madison said, look, use the army in there, keep the people out of the area. And just like it always happens, they just move in anyway and dare the army and the authorities to force people out. So any proof that you need that the settlement is happening at record pace is the fact that Mississippi and Alabama become states in 1817 and 1819 respectively. And that tells you something about the thresholds you have to reach to go from territory to statehood, and then there you are. The migrants in the area are rich, they're poor, they're speculators, squatters, slave owners, single men, slaves. Again, a mix of Americans moving to this very, as they're soon to find out, rich, soil-rich areas of the American Southwest. A great majority come from the upland areas, meaning the established South already, Georgia. Georgia settlers move. Tennessee settlers, those in the Carolinas. So Tennessee, which you don't think is a traditionally older part of the American South, is where these folks move to seek better economic opportunities. And they also are mixed with a healthy group of Europeans. Scots-Irish, French, Irish, English. Between 1810 and 1820, the Alabama population increases 12-fold. It's just staggering when you think about it. By 1820, it's 128,000. Mississippi, in the same time period, 1810 to 1820, doubles. This is the basis of what we call the Black Belt. It's the soil that is in the area. That's what we're talking about. The overflow soil from the natural levees, the rich river soil of the Mississippi and others, it's just the other one, dumps this silt onto the ground, and it just makes it a very prosperous area of the world. It's amazing in the case of Mississippi, because let me tell you something about this, putting it into perspective. Now, while the Treaty of Fort Jackson signed away a lot of that area of Alabama from the creek to the United States, the Choctaw and Chickasaw still control 2/3 of the state of Mississippi. And so the population doubles in spite of that. Population of Louisiana also doubled in this time period to 153,000. And for the first time, we're seeing more European descent than the rival Creole population, meaning, first, second generation, and those that have been there for several generations, the Creole white and black population. Yeah, go ahead.
Can you repeat the
Sure.
size that Louisiana grows?
Louisiana, we're talking in the time period from 1810 to 1820, okay? And the population of Louisiana doubled, and it doubled to 153,000, so roughly 75,000 at the beginning of this time period. Again, enough to achieve statehood, which it did in 1812, and then it continued to grow very significantly. Is it any surprise that the settlers in the middle of Mississippi chose to establish their capital and name it Jackson, Mississippi? The Great Migration to the Southwest focused on certain areas. It's basically between Natchez and Mississippi and up the Tennessee River Valley into Alabama. It's the area of the Creek lands, which we nicknamed the Black Belt. At the time, they also called it Alabama fever. So think of the gold rush. Think of the movement into upstate New York after the American Revolution, into Ohio. We have these significant times of American migration. You could buy land on credit, that helped. Land was cheap. 160 acres at $2 an acre. That was the going price for land. You could put 25% down, meaning only a quarter of it. You had to put up that amount of money, and the rest you could pay off in 4 years, which it was expected you would from the returns you got on what you were growing. The government then started to sell between 1 and 2.5 million acres each year from 1815 to 1818. And these statistics are there in the notes, just to give you an idea of what we're talking about, the scope and speed at which there was settlement. And there wasn't apparently enough to sell. So they even thought about it as quickly as it went and trying to acquire more. The government thought, should we raise the price of land? Is it too inexpensive? And the answer was no. President Monroe cannot get Congress to change the price of land and to increase it, possibly even double it. And what they did instead was not only not keep the price, raise it up, they decided they would cut in half the minimum that you needed to buy from 160 acres to 80 acres. So at that point, you had to come up with what? My math isn't great. $160, a quarter of which you could pay up front, and the rest you could borrow. Now, I lay this out because it's apparent that the good times of buying land on credit and the returns you get on that land were going to, of course, last for quite a while. Ooh, foreshadowing. And you get the money back. I mean, if you were the government, that's the way you raised revenue in the United States. It cost you, the government, not so much to, survey the land, and you're going to get that money back. It's an idea as old as time. I mean, people economically do well, you can then tax them and, for other purposes. And when they do well, everybody does well. Prices did eventually climb, but that was after a lot of pressure was put on the Congress. And then choice land. Now, if you bought land on speculation, which you could, if you bought it and didn't have an intention of living there, you could seize the best land, move into the area again, and get with surveyors. And you would then try to purchase the most choice land. Where was the most choice land? Near water transportation. We mentioned the complete lack of roads in the American South, right? The Natchez Trace being kind of the only one. We mentioned we saw one that connected parts of Georgia. Yeah, that was about it. So if you could get near a river hub, that land could command as high as $50 an acre. And so, yeah, land is great, it's cheap. You know, it's like the whole mythology of the Homestead Act in 1862 that was passed during the Civil War. Oh my gosh, free land for anybody who settles there. Well, land that was actually open under the Homestead Act wasn't land that a lot of people wanted. It wasn't great land. So there was, you know, this advertisement done, literature was printed in other languages to encourage people. I mean, why do, you know, Norwegians and Swedes come over to Missouri in the aftermath of the Civil War? I mean, Hermanoff, you've got these towns going west to St. Louis. Well, it's because it was promised to be an Eden on earth. The reality is what? Sod houses, burning, you know, buffalo chips to use as fuel, and you know, a little bit different than everyone painted this very favorable pictures. So aside from people moving there, and land is business, lawyers found plenty to keep people busy, thanks to land claims of different states, the Spanish squatters, especially in Louisiana, where you have contentious legal battles. And if you couldn't resort to a lawyer, you often resorted to violence. The Old Southwest, lest we forget, is a violent place. Even by the high threshold of violence we seem to have throughout our own history. Institutions of local government are not always set up fast enough, and they can't keep up with the needs. I think for those of you who remember or don't, I will remind you about the, what is this harken back to? The regulators in South Carolina, their big complaint before the American Revolution wasn't that the government that existed was corrupt. There wasn't enough government institutions and bureaucracy for these settlers in northwestern South Carolina. So Professor Hyde down at Southeastern in Hammond has written about this, the violence in the Florida parishes in the decades from about, the War of 1812 until even after the American Civil War. And I'm blanking out on Pistols and Politics. That's the name of his book, Sam Hyde, over at Southeastern. Yeah, I mean, we're talking Hatfield and McCoy kind of violence, only that it like people like Caitlin, you always reference folks who say, with Dr. Dollar, going back to the whole idea of, oh, is that the way it worked in Louisiana? Really? Well, everyone focuses on Kentucky and Tennessee, but when you look at that section, the northeast corner of Louisiana, in the foot part of the boot, in other words, he's made a career writing about what took place, going back to the contention between the Americans and the Spanish and the French there, and another Americans moving in, and just, yeah, it was a mess.
What is the name of that book again?
I think it's Pistols and Politics. Yeah, Doctor. And he presents on it and continues to write on that subject, and it's kind of the definitive story of that region of the nation. Men fought duels. They did not always follow the so-called code of honor that all of you read about in the Freeman book. They were brawls, there were fistfights, there were shootouts. The Natchez Trace was legendary as being a dangerous place.
I was gonna say, since you said like the whole lack of regulation and bureaucracy, I know we don't get to this in this town, but would like Bleeding Kansas be a perfect example?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Kansas became kind of a graveyard for governors in the time after the Kansas-Nebraska went into effect, and absolutely. But there, I mean, the stakes are a little bit different. I mean, it's to determine whether or not the territory is going to allow slavery to be legally protected, or the free soilers who are moving there would be able to ban it. But yeah, I mean, that's a great parallel. Absolutely, I would say. And the difference being here, the family resentments and issues that Professor Hyde talks about go for generations. Kansas was literally settled by the time of the Civil War. Although, like Kansas and Missouri folks, I think to this day still don't like each other all that much. But yeah, that's a good comparison to make. Absolutely. So the Natchez Trace again, it's from Natchez in Mississippi to Nashville. It's got a rough reputation for violence. There were attacks, lynchings, white on white, white on black crime, attacks against Indians began to enter the folklore about the cruel violence that was there, and it was a reality, just showing the stakes involved in people trying to survive economically. What makes this area a haven is the high price of cotton. That's why people are moving there, and the fact that cotton can grow there, and cotton can grow there successfully, beginning after 1812. The problem with cotton had always been how to what? Pull the seed out of the plant. And to do that, sorry, let me get the right thing here. There we go. Okay, go back to the slides here. I want to show you the game-changing invention by a man from the north, Eli Whitney. This is the cotton engine, or the cotton gin for short. He's from, I think, Rhode Island, memory serves, and he traveled after the American Revolution to plantations in Georgia, and they grew Sea Island cotton in South Carolina and Georgia, which is great. Small, domestic manufacturing for the home market use, not the massive amounts we're going to export later. And this is what he saw. This is what he was told by farmers and plantation owners. What slows me down, what allows someone to, a slave or someone else who is a free man who's just happened to be growing his own cotton, is to get the seeds out of the cotton boll. And this is what Whitney comes up with in 1791, a cotton gin, a cotton engine. So again, this reminder of the perfect storm of developments that take place. The difficulty of processing the short staple cotton changes with the invention of the cotton gin. The other factor is the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815. The stunted American economy based on the fact that our ships traveled at their own risks and our trade had been effectively shut down. So there was something of a delay in this new crop making its way out into the world. Within a year of the end of the war, the price in New Orleans of American cotton doubles to 27 cents a pound. That doesn't sound like a lot, but with the cotton gin, you can, as a field hand or someone else who is a small farmer growing cotton, go from manufacturing 1 pound a day to 50 a day. I mean, wow. This is just an absolute game changer. It's like talking about the other technical innovation that happens around the same time, the completion of the Erie Canal. Freight rates, the amount that you are spending on transportation through upstate New York, dropped 90%. If you told a company we could save you 90% in one of your major expenses, you would say, okay, how do I make that possible? So here we have it. The demand for cotton, the land, the cotton gin, and other factors that are going to be involved as well. And the demand, more importantly, for American cotton. Good soil in the American Southwest, Western Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and 200 frost-free days. Now you can develop short staple cotton. Mm-hmm. That's what really makes it in that area. It means the region is going to become economically stable after 1812 in a big way. The backcountry of South Carolina, just to give you a comparison, numbers are there, statistics are there to show you a drastic change. The backcountry of South Carolina could yield 300 pounds of cotton per acre. In Alabama, you can expect to have 800 to 1,000 pounds of cotton per acre. You're almost tripling, at very minimum, doubling the yield for your crop in this new part opened up in the United States.
How many pounds?
Sure, you go from 800 to 1,000 in Alabama. In 1820, the United States surpasses India in the world production of raw cotton. That was a big deal. It didn't take long, did it? 1815, 1816, and now 1820. It is good, by the way, for all parts of the economy of the nation. Lest we just think it benefits the South, it benefits everyone. In 1801, the United States produces 9% of the world's cotton. 50 years later, that's 1851, it is 68%, almost 70% of the world's cotton. This is why the Southern planter makes the promise, "You dare not make war on cotton, sir. Cotton is king." And that quote, I think, is from about 1850. Cotton is king. And you can see why the Confederacy thought they could leverage cotton to try to bring in foreign aid.
I mean, and still, cotton is still really big.
Yes, absolutely.
Like, it's never really gone away, the dependency on cotton.
Right, absolutely,
Everything's made
yeah.
out of it.
Yeah. No matter what we talk about synthetics and things like that, I mean,
There's still some
there's
cotton.
still cotton. Yeah, it's absolutely necessary. So the only comparison I could give you, and I put that line there in the notes, think of the boom in sugarcane in the late 16th, especially the 17th century in the Caribbean. That's the sugar boom that happens there. Or think about the oil boom in the 20th century in areas of the Middle East. Finding that raw material, refining it, and then using it to become an economic engine. Cotton cultivation requires intense labor application, as you could probably imagine. So slaves move into the area in amazing numbers. This is the movement of what we call, of course, the domestic slave trade. People were concerned. We discussed in the past how slavery shifted from the upper South to the deep South. This is the time of 1808. So this is when the United States writes the legislation to stop participation in the international slave trade. But it happens by the tens of thousands. Oh my gosh, it's like the supply will dry up. Now what will we do? Well, you move slaves from the old colonial South to the American Southwest, the Black Belt. It also means that slaves and whites moved from areas that had once processed tobacco and rice and indigo, from the old South to the deep South. Most planters, if they just up and sold their stakes in the old South, not surprisingly brought their slaves with them, either with a trader or an employee that he might hire on the trek south. So there was someone to supervise what they called the coffles, is the word, the slave coffles. Coffles was a term that applied in the first passage. That's the movement of slaves from the interior in Africa to the West Coast, where they would be taken on ships, mostly to the Caribbean and to areas of mostly Brazil and the Caribbean, a small percentage going to North America. So coffles is an idea and a term which applies to anywhere from, we think, 12 to maybe even 100 slaves who would walk 25 miles or so a day on average when it was not growing season. You didn't move slaves when they could be used to process the different crops of the Old South. You waited until after they had been done, probably in the late winter, and before you want to put the new crop into the ground. This took 6 to 8 weeks. This is an overland trip. Some would use shipping lanes. Yes, some you could see here would go from the areas of the colonial South, Wilmington, Charleston, around Florida, and make their way into Mobile and New Orleans. And then the slaves and their owners and others, but that required more expense. Some had the luxury to do that. Most decided to take the route by walking, 6 to 8 weeks from Virginia to Alabama or Mississippi. The interstate slave trade was a big business, moving tens of thousands of African Americans. Nobody liked to discuss it. Slave owners were, as we're going to find out with Missouri, becoming increasingly defensive of the institution of slavery, defending it using different language that their parents had not employed. The whole idea of necessary evil to positive good. conditions in the new areas were usually pretty bad. This is why many people thought there was no other labor but slave labor that could be done to make sure that the back-breaking work of clearing land. I mean, you had to gird trees, cut them down, dig wells, put up rudimentary houses, all done by labor of slaves or those who did not own slaves. Not everyone there was a slave owner, to just dig out a clearing and begin to plant cotton.
And then also, they have to do like a rotation because, I mean, if they all just always plant cotton, it would dry out the soil.
Right. You have to employ that as well. Yeah. That's what they would have learned from the Old South. Tobacco took its toll, and you had to practice a crop rotation system. It's a thing that the sugar planters didn't have to necessarily go through. You can just keep planting the cane over and over again. The small farmers with few or no slaves, and that was a significant part of the population, grew corn and traded with Indians. Again, lest you forget, people have to actually eat. They raised animals, they cut down trees, sold lumber, and made it that way as well economically. Not everyone was participating in this economy of sugarcane or hemp or cotton, those crops that were grown in the new Southwest. The rise of the Cotton Kingdom was also fueling a very impressive industrial revolution on both sides of the Atlantic. An overwhelming amount goes to areas of England and the mills in that part of the world, the Liverpool and Lancashire textile mills. Go back to the notes here because we got more statistics just to show you the importance of cotton to this story. In the aftermath of the war, cotton had been a significant American export. Again, we said that we're surpassing India by 1820. In 1815, the cotton exports are about 40% of American exports. In 1840, barely 20 years later, they're nearly 60%. So yeah, the King Cotton idea is based in facts, and the statistics back that up. The fishing and maritime trade in New England was also coming back strong. We were at peace with the world, and that would last for a significant number of years. The New England economy that had been shattered because of the embargo came back, and came back very strong. Up to that point, you had watched ships rot in port, and Yankee investors had come up with new ways also to diversify their economy. Now, if your core of your economy, fishing, whaling, and trading has been just shattered and destroyed, as we saw the American exports dramatically, I mean, go down by like 75, 90% during the war, you might do something else. And enterprising individuals in New England started to make inexpensive cloth made from local wool or imported cotton from areas of the American South within the domestic sphere of the United States. So Southern planters gave up and tried abandoning tobacco and moving for lands in the American Deep South, planting cotton. Those who were in New England started shifting to manufacturing, especially accelerated after the embargo in 1807. We talked a little bit about one individual who's critical in this economic engine in New England. That's Francis Cabot Lowell. He forms a business association to construct water power mills with looms in areas of Massachusetts. I said last time this would be international espionage, right? The idea of finding an idea from another place or another country and then copying those ideas and then recreating them in the United States. That's exactly what Lowell did. He studied the textile mills in Manchester, England. And what they often did was they would search your luggage and your person when you were departing back for the United States to make sure that you, among other things, didn't have copies of plans for these mills that had been under construction and had been very successful. At this point, getting what? Indian cotton. And then American cotton starts coming in vast quantities at the end of the war. So customs officials checked your luggage for anything that you might be able to use and, God forbid, recreate in the United States. Lowell simply memorized the structure of the loom and was able to replicate it back when he reached the United States. In 1814, Lowell and his mechanic, a man named Paul Moody, can demonstrate the operational water-powered loom. There you go. That's the beginning of the Lowell Mills. New Englanders are a crafty lot overall. They find different ways to use their natural resources. One of them is ice in rivers. You chip it away, and it's great. You could do a lot of, I mean, you can make ice cream, you can chill your drinks. But the problem is getting it to other places where there isn't as much ice, or there isn't as ice for a long time. So another entrepreneur figured out that one of the byproducts of cutting down trees, making buildings, creating the Lowell Mills and other manufacturing hubs is that you get sawdust. So you pack the ice in sawdust, and there you have it, a natural insulator. You put that in giant blocks. You're going to lose a lot of it when it melts, but you ship it to different parts of the United States. I mean, early refrigeration, and there you have it. Lowell did something else. It started to employ women and concentrate on recruiting women in their mill towns. They are not just interested in creating a profit. I don't think you can sell the idea. This was not a popular notion to say, yes, let's have folks basically late teenage years, maybe to their early 20s, gather here and become part of the industrial economy permanently. So you had to build these towns with other goals in mind. So Lowell was a custom mill town. It was a mill city with other parts supporting those who worked there. It eventually took on the name of the man who died in 1817. Lowell passed away that year, but the wheels were already turning. Lowell was created where the Merrimack River dropped 30 feet, and that meant you had a falls, and you could take the river power, accelerated of the flow of the water, and make that mill become an absolute reality. They then decided to turn to women in the towns out of necessity. Why? The men were moving out of New England, just as John Calhoun was beginning to worry about the exodus of folks leaving South Carolina for Alabama and Mississippi. People in areas of New England were worried about their populations leaving for Ohio and Indiana and Illinois. So out of necessity, they turned to women in the area. Let's recruit them. But you have to make this an attractive proposition. Farm women had long supplemented their family income by weaving woolen yarn and cloth at home, in a room, with a spinning wheel, shearing lambs. Why not? They worked. There was the home production. Mm-hmm. This was going to take it to, of course, a different level. Young women left home and they were recruited by the Lowell Company and the Slater Mills, as they were also called later on, because they created not only the industrial town, they created boarding houses. For the most part, people had this stigma attached to working in a mill town. The hours were long, they were unsafe. Well, some of that was true. There was no safety net, as we would call it today, for anyone who was maimed or injured or couldn't work for a period of time. So when you did sign as a young lady in Massachusetts and New England to work at a Lowell or a Slater mill, you had to stay for a year, but the salary was impressive, $12 to $14 a month, which doesn't sound like much, but it was a decent wage. You could also spend the money. You'd want to save it ideally, but you had in the mill town ways by which you could spend the money. Shops, there were activities, there were evening lectures, a little bit, not a perfect comparison like a college campus, libraries, and of course churches. Had to have places of worship in Lowell. Mill girls there would go on to publish and edit a magazine. And so it's happening, the change in the American economy. Although not everyone welcomed it, Americans feared industrialization. Because of the type of permanent working class it would help create. That's where there were concerns. They're making comparisons with Europe. Jefferson saw it when he was in Europe and in France. Other Americans were concerned as well. It would create a large-scale industrialization, switching the economy from small farming to industry. It would create an unsettled, oppressed, and turbulent proletariat, a ticking time bomb for revolution. That was the argument. You'll see that in the Sam Patch book. Sam Patch, I think, is reflective of the idea of the economy changing, the market revolution, we call it, in the 18 teens and the 1820s. This entrepreneurial spirit, the fact that you are taking work out of the home and away from the farm and to a separate place, which, you know, we all take for granted today. Well, until kind of recently. I mean, we've worked from home again over the last year. But back then, that was very unusual to have a designated place where you went and did work because you worked on your farm. I mean, yes, you had an office, but your office was, you know, most often near your home or actually in your home. But this seemed better. This was the Lowell and Slater Mills were a way by which you could say, no, we're not going to develop that in the United States, because this work recruiting women in New England would happen for a few years, and it was a morally upright town. It was a condition by which women worked these wages, helped their family, and then they got married. That was the expectation. Again, that was assumed. I mean, not more than the expectation. It was assumed that's how things were going to work. It's not a separate permanent working class. It's a utopia-style community. That's the way it was sold. Lowell was successful. They could boast the largest concentration of industry in the United States before the Civil War. But mills were being created, the same number that we have textile mills in the North and South at 1816. This is why the South sees a scenario where they develop like the North and not separate from it, as what especially happened after 1820. Everything looked great, right? Land was cheap. Then they weren't going to raise the price of land. The price of cotton was going to remain high. Then you didn't have to buy as much land. You could buy half as much, 80 instead of 160 acres. It was trading in New Orleans at a high price until the bubble burst. It burst in 1819, a full-fledged economic panic, the Panic of 1819. That's what they called depressions back then. By then, Europe was recovering from the shortages brought on by a generation of fighting. The United States had like a monopoly of, hey, our ships are now back on the oceans. We are hauling American food crops over to Europe. Europe is devastated by the Napoleonic Wars, and it takes Europe a few years to catch up. In some ways, it's a little like the aftermath of World War I, where Europe was so devastated. The U.S. economy early in the 1920s looks like it was booming, and it was going to boom forever. But that created a pretty substantial bubble as well. Then Europe begins to be able to feed itself again. So the demand for American food crops, we think everything tied to the panic is due to cash crops. You know, you can't really eat cotton, but food crops are the critical development. And when there is less demand, it kind of feeds a significant and sustained economic downturn. The rapidly expanding supply of cotton outran demand in textile mills, and that's not good. So that means the price is going to plummet. It dropped from 32.5 cents an acre in 1818 to 14 cents an acre. Sorry, 14 cents, what am I using? A pound. 32.5 cents a pound to 14 cents a pound. So it's nearly cut by a third. London banks refused to extend more credit to not only American banks, but to American farmers. The president of the Bank of the United States decided that, well, we're going to have to protect the new institution. It's barely 3 years old. And he contracts credit which hurt, of course, the state banks. A lot of banks were lending money with the expectation land is cheap, cotton prices high, demand high. The good times will last forever. And they did not last forever, not even close. As loans were called in, paper money that was circulating, remember banks have to keep a certain amount of hard currency, specie as it was called, in the bank, not to cover all the paper money that they lend out and pass out. But what people do, and this is why we call them panics, it's the conduct of people, it's the conduct of banks. Banks will close, banks will fail, but people come in and say, all right, I have paper money. I know that it's supposed to be worth and backed by specie. If everyone who has paper money goes to turn it in for hard currency, there's not enough for the bank to cover all of that. And that's why you get a panic. Money is quickly taken out of the countryside where people have paper currency to the cities. And then it's taken out of the country altogether. When banks stop paying specie payments, they stop making specie payments. And when that happens, you have paper money. It's not seen as the same. Money now is a promissory note. I mean, this, what's it printed on there? This is good for all debts, public and private, backed up by the full faith and credit of the United States. That's what's printed on all of our currency. And that's great as long as we have both faith and credit that the money is good and that $1 will buy you something or $100 will buy something more. So the confidence in the system begins to erode. Everyone tries to save themselves. Problem is, small farmers don't have as many resources to deal with. They bought slaves and land on credit, and when the economy suffers, they are the first ones who are going to be hurt. They lost mortgaged farms, they lost mortgaged homes. Demand for their goods and services begin to shrivel. Employees are laid off. We don't have any metric or measure of the unemployment rate in 1819. Who knows? They didn't take that statistic. Historians call it the Panic of 1819. Sometimes it was called also hard times. That was what people just said, hard times. It lasts 3 to 4 years. Now we have panics throughout the 19th century. We call them recessions or depressions now. I think that was coined really after the stock market crash in 1929. Yeah, eventually people just called it the Hoover Depression for the most part, and that name seemed to stick. I love the fact that this is really, as far as I know, the only economic crisis where the president doesn't get totally blamed for, oh, why aren't you doing anything? I mean, the next one we have is what, 1836? It ruins the Van Buren presidency. We have one before the Civil War. We have one in 1873. We have one in 1893. Panics, as they were called. And people begin to question the role of the government. The migration into the Northwest and the Southwest of the United States stop. The government had sold some land and tried to sell it on the cheap. Up to that point, they had sold a total of about, remember how you could buy land? You could buy it on credit, you could buy it on speculation. The government sold $44 million worth of land going into 1819, and they had only collected half of the money for it. Whoopsie. Yeah, I mean, you're supposed to pay it back in 3 or 4 years, but if you don't have any money to pay it, you can't. People started to sell land back to the government if they made no improvement to the land that they bought, meaning they hadn't invested anything in it. So they're selling it back. This is not what the United States government wants to happen. The panic has been called, by one historian, a traumatic awakening to the capitalist reality of boom and bust. Let me say that differently. People thought the takeaway from the panic was, I've worked hard, done everything I should be doing. Why did things fail? It's the first of what the public recognizes and understands today. We have recurrent phenomenons and sharp downward cycles. It happens in the United States. 200 years later, it still happens. And the government can't always figure out what to do about it and be the relief for it, for everyone. So again, it's this feeling of, just frustration. You have to understand worldwide events played a role in the Panic of 1819. Because it is national and across the board, folks don't have any perspective about the length of the so-called hard times. It lasts 3 to 4 years. The next one lasts longer, more like 7. Panic of 1837 goes well into the 1830s. That's when people shut up the doors and start hanging signs on their shop saying GTT, gone to Texas. Yeah, that one's worse. Previous economic troubles, and this is why they don't have a metric or a way to anecdotally kind of compare and say, oh, well, we'll get out of this, because nothing like this had happened across the economic spectrum. When we did have economic downturns, the end of the French and Indian War, the end of the American Revolution, it was not universal. Previous troubles were caused by war, disaster. The closest they could compare, obviously, in their own lifetime would have been the War of 1812. But in 1819, they're beginning to understand that the international scope of the economy is more and more clear. People were producing for more than just their home. They were producing for an outside market. This is why we are christening this time period the Market Revolution after 1816 through the time of Andrew Jackson. It's a slap in the face. It's a reminder to people that you are now part of a more connected, interconnected world that's susceptible to the cold outside economic forces. The Napoleonic Wars end. That's great, yeah, for a while, until it's not great, till Europe can feed itself and your farm in Indiana fails. You bought the land because the land was cheap and you were going to supply grain around the United States and the world, and then it all went south. Again, this is not just confined to the American Southwest. It becomes profoundly disturbing to a lot of Americans. This is the psychological aspect of the Panic of 1819. That your personal fortune was not related to merit. It was hard work. Some people inherited the land. We get it. Generationally, that happens. But these folks are like, I don't understand. I mean, I did everything. I worked hard, or people I owned worked hard, and now it's all over. I have to sell slaves. I have to sell land. I have to, up and move back. Imagine, saying you're going to settle from Georgia over to Alabama and having to go back to family or loved ones or friends or family connections because it all failed. American crops got hit a lot harder than European crops. No one had, of course, the knowledge or perspective that we have today. And like everyone else in 2021, in 1819, they wanted to find a person or institution to blame. And a lot of people thought they found one with the Bank of the United States, the bus, in other words. Though it did not create it, the perception was the Bank of the United States continued to make the panic worse, or keep the United States in a state of panic. It never helped matters that during the good years, the bank was seen as failing to give credit. They didn't extend enough loans to individuals when things were good. That's why it became kind of this convenient scapegoat in the aftermath of the panic. When it contracted money, it did help the bank. When loans obviously were called in, continued to be called in, when credit was contracted, meaning they weren't going to give more loans, or they weren't going to extend loans. It helped the bank. Again, this is what a bank has to do to survive in any financial institution. But as far as the national psyche was concerned about the bank, it didn't make them very popular. And wanting to see a scapegoat in the Panic of 1819, some folks in Maryland especially like to target their branch of the Bank of the United States as particularly corrupt. managers in the Maryland Bank of the Bank of the United States, the branch opened in that state, had historically mismanaged and embezzled funds to the tune of millions of dollars. And that seemed to be a perfect situation by which members of, or people within Maryland thought we could actually challenge the constitutionality of the bank. The state legislature then levied a tax of $15,000 on the branch in its state. It's like the Federal Reserve. If you open up the dollar, you'll see the code, the letter on the currency that indicates every letter is for the Federal Reserve in New York and Philadelphia, San Francisco, St. Louis, all around the United States. So the bus had branches scattered in the U.S. The Maryland Bank, again, not a good reputation being mismanaged for a long time. So the state passed the law and essentially said, we're going to charge, the state will charge the national bank a tax to do business in our state. The man who's running the branch of the Maryland Bank says no, he outright refuses to pay the tax. And so the state takes the branch cashier, he's a man named James McCulloch, to court. This is the fabled McCulloch versus Maryland Supreme Court decision that is put in place in 1819. The case makes its way to the United States Supreme Court. On the court is none other than Federalist and economic nationalist John Marshall, appointed by John Adams in 1801. It wasn't a midnight appointment, but he was appointed basically after the election of Jefferson or Burr, whoever it might be. And even though federalism was basically dead as an economic force and a legitimate political power, John Marshall still reigned supreme on the courts. He had two questions, the Marshall Court. Again, he's the Chief Justice, so that's why we give it that name, the so-called Marshall Court. And two questions to answer in the whole court case. The first, had Congress been well within its rights? Said differently, is the bank constitutional? Is the bank constitutional? And to that question, it's a decision that would have made Alexander Hamilton very, very happy. Though not explicitly said, this is what Marshall concedes in the opinion. And he writes the opinion because he's the Chief Justice and he can. He writes a lot of the early opinions. He wrote the Marbury one, he wrote this one as well, and he'll serve on the court for basically another generation. Had Congress been within its right to incorporate the bank under the Constitution, he says, well, it doesn't say, bank okay in Constitution, but in the implied powers, in the phrase that Hamilton used, a necessary and proper clause of Article 1, under that, it is Marshall who believes the bank is constitutional. The phrase he said, and this is words taken from Marshall's opinion, the phrase means appropriate, and the bank was appropriate. It's plainly adapted and it's not prohibited. So in other words, he's confirming the constitutionality. Everyone who says the bank is bad, the bank is the cause of the panic, maybe in your mind it wasn't. It maybe made things worse, and that's what other people's perception was, but it's not going anywhere. The bank is chartered in 1816. Even going back to the 1791 charter is legal, according to Marshall. Now, did everyone say, oh, Marshall made his opinion, great, we agree? No. Andrew Jackson still thought the bank in his presidency was not constitutional. He never cared what John Marshall said about it. The second question in front of the court was whether or not this state, the state of Maryland, levying that $15,000 tax against the bank, could a state tax the bank? The bank's lawyer is Daniel Webster. He's one of what's known as, there was a book written about Clay Calhoun Webster. It's called The Great Triumvirate, meaning three. We may not have Cicero in American history as far as a comparison, but we have these three giants, and they were, that presided almost 50 years in American politics in different capacities, all vying for the presidency, all getting close, some closer than others. Clay got real close. Serving in Congress, the House, the Senate, on the scene around the time of the War of 1812, and on the scene until the 1850 Compromise, or not long after that, each of them pass away. So Webster is the lawyer representing the bank. The power to tax, he said, is the power to destroy. And that was the opinion that Marshall upheld. Quote, states have no power by taxation or otherwise to retard, impede, burden, or in any manner control the operations of the federal government or its agencies, unquote. So the two questions: the bank was constitutional, yes. Could a state levy a tax on a national institution? No. And so there you have it. When Ohio tried the same thing by force, the tax was actually collected. So that played out another way. They actually, the bus in the branch in the state of Ohio eventually closed as a result of having to pay that tax. I guess the decision wasn't made in time. Though it would be debated for decades, everyone asked the question in 1819, where do we go from here? Because the panic lasted for 3 to 4 years. Eventually, there is a restoration of the confidence people had in business. Should we reconstitute the banking system? Many asked. Should there be more tariff protection? Again, people are throwing out questions about how to prevent this from happening again. Should there be government sponsorship of transportation programs? That's going to make people like Webster and Clay more economic nationalists, the result of the panic. Yeah.
Couldn't the people just working at the bank just stop taking the money that was illegal? I mean, that would.
The banks would close. Yeah, that's what they would do.
Yeah, I mean, so why would they just stop embezzling money?
Great question. Yeah.
That's a great way to solve that.
This is the warning that the people in the 1791 bank question had. It would be able to literally, because it was going to be located in the same city as the capital temporarily, bankers could just walk to Congress and pay off the politicians.
Oh my God.
This being burned by banking practices and the people in the bank, answering to no one. This is what fuels Jackson's deep anti-banking issues, that he leads I think, a personal vendetta against the bank when he's president, the so-called bank war. And who's on the other side of it but none other than Henry Clay, the bank war. Read Jackson's bank veto message, and you see a lot. He encapsulates a lot of the American concerns, fears about the leadership of the bank. It's undemocratic. It's controlled by foreigners. There's no, what we would today say, accountability. So yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And we don't have the government backing the deposits of individuals for another 100 and something years, not until the FDIC during the New Deal. We don't have bankruptcy laws. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was going to say, I'm not going to lie. You said proletariat, and now you just mentioned the fact that, like, the whole bank, how they can do that. I can see Lenin having, like, a stroke hearing this. You made a mention to the proletariat earlier. I know this is not American. It's just one of those. It's just like whole. If that makes sense.
Yeah. I'm sorry, I can't hear you that well, and something about the proletariat.
Oh, I said, let me see if I can. So I said, like, since you mentioned proletariat earlier, and you just mentioned right now about the bank being able to. I was saying, like, man, that sounds like something like Lenin would want to do.
Yeah. I mean, less than 100 years later. Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah, less than 100 years later. I mean, he would be talking about the ideas that were Marx and Engels were first considering in the 50s and 60s, when that literature was out there. And of course, 100 years from the Panic of 1819, we have what the Red Scare. I mean, you tie it all together with the panic that takes place among people who think that there'd be a proletariat revolution in the United States because of all the strikes, the aftermath of what? Another war, this time World War I. So yeah, I think the parallels are absolutely there, definitely. So what do we do after the panic? And the other legislation that we don't have yet, even though there's talk of it, is a national bankruptcy law, which doesn't happen really until the 1840s is when that eventually goes into Congress. So what are the answers if we're going to maybe encourage the government to increase transportation programs, expand credit, or others say reform the moral mode of the American economy. Slow down government spending, slow down a reliance on paper money, and encourage frugality in the nation. This is a common refrain in the United States. The pursuit of money has led us to this situation. States should, some said, pass what they call stay laws to avoid foreclosures and bankruptcies. I mean, don't collect. The state steps in and says, no, we can prevent the collection of money for taxes or try to slow down foreclosures by passing these laws. You have to understand that people really, really thought this economic failure was taken upon them. It was a sign of embarrassment. I mean, it's still the mindset 100 years later when people lose their jobs and can't find work in the Great Depression. You know, the whole people jumping out of windows thing. I mean, it did happen. Maybe not to the degree that it's been talked about. The same year in the court's decision, the Marshall Court invalidates a New York law which facilitates bankruptcies. It's a violation of contract law. So there's the court standing and not taking the side of a New York law, which allows bankruptcies to happen and to have bankruptcy protection. I think this is going to change people's minds and the attitudes of state and a national bankruptcy law. But the fact that the court invalidated it in 1819 probably is due to the fact that this is the first depression in national history. There is no sense that the federal government could have prevented it. Monroe kind of escapes any blame. The blame goes to the bus, not to Monroe, which I think is interesting. Really, he's the only president where we have some kind of economic downturn that everyone casts their eyes on the federal government. What are you going to do? Monroe, here's the proof of it. In 1820, he is reelected without any opposition. He basically wins every single electoral vote except one because an elector said, I want George Washington to be the only president who's ever won every single electoral vote. And so in spite of the fact that there's no real opposition or anyone running against James Monroe, they say, yeah, and hopefully he will. But again, there's the proof that the nation doesn't blame the president of the United States. The one electoral vote was cast for John Quincy Adams in 1820, by the way, because I knew someone may have asked that question. So some say in the aftermath, there should be more involvement with the government. Others say there should be less, there should be more frugality. The Panic of 1819 remains the only nationwide depression in American history when the voters did not turn against an administration in Washington. So, you know, throw out the incumbent president, throw out the incumbent party that has a majority in the House and Senate. It doesn't happen. But this is a serious challenge to the so-called era of good feelings. The other serious challenge happens in the new territory in the United States, which we're going to just very briefly mention and get back to and devote all of our attention to next week. And that's the application of Missouri as the first territory to be carved out of the Louisiana Purchase. Now, I know you're thinking, what about Louisiana? But let's face it, that was an established territory, the Orleans Territory. At the time we acquired it, 50,000 white, black folks there. under the Spanish and the French system. The Panic of 1819 doesn't prevent the re-election of Monroe, but another crisis occurred at the same time to give the nation a really bad scare. This is the Missouri Compromise. This is the map. We're showing how the compromisers worked out. But while it was taking place, it literally was called the Missouri Crisis, 1819 to 1821. So on the heels of the Panic, we have this as well. It also began to split the one-party government under President Monroe. He was a proud Jeffersonian Republican in the tradition of his mentors in politics, Jefferson and Madison. And now he saw a possible scenario where the country was going to be divided over territorial lines, North and South. So the era of good feelings was not threatened as much with the Panic as it was threatened by the Missouri Crisis. By 1819, we have enough settlers crossing the Missouri River into the Missouri Territory, which it can meet the requirements to apply for statehood. The question in 1819 is, we'll leave this for next time, can Congress attach conditions to the Missouri statehood law? Yes or no? That was the unknown. And this is why it becomes not just something for a session of Congress, but several subsequent issues. Because some people say yes, some people say no. There's a whole question of representation as far as, all right, we have in 1819, 22 states, 11 free, 11 slave states. Missouri, if it joins one way or the other, could determine the remaining settlement of the Louisiana Territory. So again, what you decide here is going to decide and be based on future decisions. I mean, if Missouri were to become originally a free state, all the remainder of the Louisiana Territory would no doubt be free states. Okay, so we're going to leave that today and talk about it next time. The Missouri Crisis debates become the first public debates about slavery also. This is the troubling part for Monroe and company ever since the 1790 anti-slavery petitions that came in from the New York and Pennsylvania Quaker delegations. One was signed with a cover letter by Benjamin Franklin. We know what they did back then. They scooted the whole thing to the side and said, let's not deal with it right now. We've made our decision about the international slave trade. And yeah, now it comes up again because no one wanted it to. But what actually takes place is that people begin to talk about Missouri, but they talk about the institution of slavery itself. So they're using these words that their parents used, a necessary evil, and now they're shifting the defense of slavery to a positive good. The positive good argument starts to first be vocalized out there in the Missouri Compromise debates. And we're also going to talk about the Denmark-Vesey conspiracy on the heels of solving the Missouri crisis and kind of kicking the can down the road as politicians have a tendency to do. We had another slave conspiracy, this time in South Carolina. And for almost 200 years, we've been trying to figure out who was involved, how many people were involved, and to what level within the Charleston community was Vesey putting together an attempt to overthrow slavery in that state. It's still a topic of deep historical division.